1. Chapter 1. Tyrus sighed. Sweat dripped from his brow and caked his entire body. His undergarments were clinging to his skin like those tights he'd seen traveling dancers wear. Those things must have been horribly uncomfortable. The angry yellow sun overhead shone down atop the encampment, reflecting off armored soldiers seemingly on purpose as to irritate the eye. The sun was indeed a bastard. You would think sunlight would have a more difficult time reflecting off of black metal, but that was not the case. White canvas flaps opened and closed as soldiers, cooks, quartermasters, and officers went about their business, crushing green grass underfoot. From his place atop Alnus Hill, he had a great view of the war camp. It stretched out in each direction for miles, surrounding Alnus like white petals. The tents stretched onward until they hit the thick forest that encircled this hill. While the trees were distant, Tyrus knew for certain that those trees bore wide leaves that cast large shadows on the earth below them. Nice comfy shade, but miles away. Tyrus shook his head, his slightly oversized open-faced helm tilting slightly with the motion. He leaned his black tower shield against his leg as he readjusted the helm. The Empire didn't care if their troops' armor didn't fit, only that they had it on. Tyrus was convinced that his helm was given to him by a grumpy quartermaster. They had probably thought it'd be funny to give an orc's helm to him instead of human standard. Wait, orc auxiliaries didn't wear helmets, right? Tyrus was not sure. He generally tried to keep away from those pig faces. He'd never known a friendly orc in his life. He continued to stand guard at the top of Alnus Hill, the bone-white warning horn sitting at his belt. He continued trying to ignore the sweat beating down his entire body, but it was difficult. No shade for him whatsoever. A soldier's job is not to be comfortable, a tiny voice said in the back of his mind. He ignored the thought. Tyrus would hear none of its heresy. When was that blasted gate going to open anyhow? They had been stationed here for months now, and nothing appeared. Tyrus had heard of the gate, but had his doubts that such a thing really existed. Sure, people said that it was a part of history and whatnot, but Tyrus didn't know how to read. If the gate was written in history, then he knew nothing about it, other than the fact that it would provide a new world to invade, new peoples and treasures to bring into Falmart. That sounded pretty cool. Perhaps he could find a pretty trinket to bring back to Delilah? The thought warmed his heart. He'd do anything to see that smile of hers. Tyrus would be able to see that smile if the damn gate would just blow the horn. His commander shouted, the red mohawk plume on top of his helmet blowing in a sudden wind. The gate has appeared. Tyrus turned around to see that, indeed, the gate was real. It was a marvelous structure. The front of the gate itself was shaped like the entrance to a mausoleum, with a square body and triangular roof. Several large turquoise gems glowed in between the marble pillars beside the entrance. By the gods, those must have been worth as much as the imperial palace. Maybe if he convinced a few friends of his to help him remove them. Tyrus banished the thought. He'd not get his head cut off for a shiny gem, no matter how big it was. Another drew his eye that sat directly above the gaping black maw of the archway. It was cut the same as the other gems, but was near 3 times the smaller size. Its glow was also far more powerful, being nearly painful to stare at. Tyrus, you damned idiot, blow that horn, or I'll get your Delilah to blow me. The officer shouted at him, his face red with rage. Tyrus bit back his retort and quickly blew the horn. Not a good idea to insult a commanding officer, no matter how much of an unbearable ass they were. The sound echoed across the once open plains surrounding Alnus Hill, and immediate movement followed. Black-plated soldiers waving the banner of the Empire led platoons of troops with tower shields toward the entrance of the newly formed gate. He knew the basics of the plan. Tower shields in front with cavalry directly behind, followed by dragon riders and ogres and all the other troops that should be on the front line. Damned beast people and dragon riders. The riders were always cocky and annoying. It'd be nice if something on the other side would humble them a little. He was tired of them constantly correcting him on the difference between a dragon and a wyvern. Like there was a difference. Any lizard with wings was a dragon. It didn't matter how many bloody legs they had. Those banners continued to lead troops up the large hill, and Tyrus winced at the Empire's symbol. It had always unnerved him. A golden cross sat in the middle, with the shapes of dragon wings spread out between each section of the cross. This overlapped the symbol of a dragon on a purple background, or maybe it was a griffin. Tyrus had never been able to tell. He wasn't sure why the banner made him so uncomfortable, It was the flag of his nation, right? Why couldn't he feel more patriotic about it? All right, it was because he didn't much like the Empire. Soon the first platoon entered through the gate, putting up their shields for whatever lay ahead in the new world. Tyrus didn't envy the poor bastards. Front lines for something like this might be a guaranteed death sentence. What if the new world was populated with humans the size of mountains? How would the Empire conquer that? Giants like that would have giant jewelry. So maybe the Empire would simply steal away with whatever valuables they could. If they were small enough, the giants might not even notice the Empire slowly chipping away at their gold necklaces. That would be amazing. And of course the dragon riders would get swatted at like flies. It was perfect. He rolled his shoulders as he was ordered in formation. Thankfully, he was positioned at the very back. That would provide a better opportunity to run away like a coward if this invasion went sour. He didn't care if he was called a coward. He wasn't ready to die for his country. Delilah was more important than patriotism. His stern-faced commander mounted his horse and motioned forward into the black mouth of the gate. It truly was unsettling, like entering nothing. Not just darkness, nothing. Like he would fall for eternity if he were to step over that threshold. If the men in front of him fell, then he'd flee right there and then. He'd wear his shield on his back to stop any arrows and make his escape. Yeah, just before they passed through the gate, however, Tyrus could see an orange light approaching them at a fast pace. A man carrying a torch on horseback, perhaps? Maybe the other side did have giants after all. That thought, however, proved to be wrong when a glowing orange ball of magic collided with his commander's head. There was no death scream. The man simply fell from his horse to the dirt. The orange ball had dissipated into flame upon its collision, lighting the commander's short red cape afire and melting the metal helmet to black and charred skin. Tyrus saw that, blinked, and then looked back up to the gate. That was when he saw the glowing orange dots that alighted the cavernous mouth. They weren't speeding towards them. They merely remained where they were. They weren't flame balls then. They floated below the ceiling as well, dozens of floating orange dots just sitting there. Then they all blinked. Tyrus dropped his spear and shield and began running down the hill as the mouth exploded with motion. He heard inhuman shrieks and roars follow after him, accompanied by the pained screams of his fellow soldiers. Nope, he kept running down the hill, the incline giving speed to his mad sprint. He tossed off his ill-fitted helmet as he went, the piece of armor rolling down the hill alongside him. He turned his head to see a massive horned monster roaring as it tore men apart with its bare hands. Its arms made the trees far ahead of him look thin, and it was easily as tall as an ogre. Its gray body was pocked and marred with claw marks and other wounds which were covered by the blood and gore of an unfortunate soldier. Nope, he kept running, eventually reaching the bottom of the hill at the same time as his helmet. Tyrus turned his head again, seeing giant red floating creatures with no limbs and cavernous mouths shadow the encampment. Wide blue glowing cavernous mouths opened to fire bouts of those energy balls down on the camp, setting tents alight and burning soldiers to ash. Other flying creatures followed, with leathery wings and pale flesh. Green globs of what appeared to be the thing's spittle flew in tandem with the other energy balls, colliding with every soldier and tent it possibly could. Nope, he ran between the burning tents, smoke filling his lungs. Tyrus still kept running despite the burning pain in his chest and the searing pain at the back of his throat. Death screams sounded from everywhere, and Tyrus quickened his pace. A man appeared before him from one of the flaming tents, the armor having been fused to the poor fellow and sloughing off of him like a metallic soup. Fire spouted up from his back, sending plumes of black smoke into the air. Tyrus sidestepped the man, who gave a pleading cry at his back. Despite himself, Tyrus felt guilty. There was nothing he could do for that man. He was going to be dead soon anyway, and Tyrus wasn't becoming a metal mush today if he could help it. He saw a horse running unsaddled through the camp towards him. Tyrus didn't consider himself a good rider, and the fact that the beast didn't have a saddle discouraged him even further. However, he needed to get the hell out of here before he was melted by one of those things. He positioned himself to grapple the thing's neck and swing onto its back. It wouldn't work most likely, but the adrenaline pumping through his system helped him to ignore the odds. Before the galloping steed could draw close, an orange and blue-skinned thing with bony white spikes jutting up from its back and elbows leaped onto the horse's neck, clawing and biting with ravenous hunger. The horse continued its gallop for only a moment before it collapsed with a neigh. Tyrus took a step back as more of the things ran for the fallen horse, ripping it apart and shoving bloody viscera down their gullets as they swarmed it like ants on a sweet. Tyrus turned heel and ran in the other direction. Nope. As he turned, he saw a large man standing before him. No, not a man, another monster. Two pairs of black horns jutted up from the thing's skull, curving in two directions, and deep-set, glowing red eyes glared at him with hatred. It had no nose and was bald with pale maggot-colored flesh. Besides the horns, the head looked like a skull. The mouth was concealed by a green metal mask, and that same metal encased its legs and left arm entirely. A pauldron with an odd symbol etched into its surface reflected in the firelight. That pauldron also covered the right side of the thing's chest, and a round glowing orb was set deep within its confines. In its bare right hand, it carried a glowing red double-edged axe. Tyrus flinched upon seeing the transparent symbols in the glow of the axe's blades. An odd thing was belted at its waist. A double-barreled metal staff. Was this thing capable of magic? Malik Dotal. It shouted at him in a rough tongue, pointing its glowing axe at him. Tyrus turned again, opting to run between burning tents rather than deal with the pack of orange creatures. The horn man thing shouted at him again, and Tyrus heard an ear-ringing explosion follow after him. Several dozen holes ripped through the canvas of a nearby tent, blowing the thing over completely and blocking his would-be escape with burning canvas. Tyrus turned again to see the monster approach him with heavy footsteps. Tyrus's eyes darted back and forth, looking for an escape that wouldn't get him chopped in half or set to blaze. There was no escape. The horned thing would be able to hit him easily with as much space was allowed between the flaming tents. Tyrus fell to his knees, and the creature gave what sounded to be a laugh. By the gods, he was really going to die like this. He never should have signed up for this damned cursed army. He should have stayed home with Delilah. She was never going to know how he died. He looked skyward, praying to whatever god was listening to save his skin. The smoke-blackened sky was a stark contrast to what it had been earlier. Where before this reverse invasion it had been clear and cloudless, it was now nearly black with smog. Tyrus sniffled as tears welled up in his eyes. His lungs strained for clean, smokeless air. He turned his gaze back at the laughing monster before him. Another flaming tent had fallen behind the creature, completely encircling the two as what had to be a demon reared back to strike Tyrus's head from his body. That was when he came. A large man in green-plated armor ran through the flames behind the demon, and before the thing could turn, the Green Knight punched its fucking head off in a spray of red gore. For horns flew in random directions as the man continued forward at an incredible speed, passing Tyrus without a second thought. Tyrus had barely glimpsed the man before he passed through the roaring flames without care. Broad arms carried a metal double-barreled staff much like the one the demon carried, but with what looked to be a golden hook at the end of it. Tyrus noted the similarities of the armor between the demon and the Green Knight. The only difference he spotted in the brief glimpse being that the man's breastplate covered his entire torso, as opposed to the demon's barely half. He had been wearing gauntlets covered in several small spikes, or were they studs, with what appeared to have been a blade attached to the underarm of his left arm. Something was also mounted upon the shoulder on the left of the Green Knight's head, some sort of odd green cube thing. But none of that was anything before the gaze behind that transparent visor. The Green Knight's glare nearly made Tyrus faint with fear. He stood from the ground and covered his nose using the short red cape at his back. He'd need to soak the cape in water if he could find one of the cooked tents. He looked down at the dead demon's fallen axe and quirked an eyebrow. Looking around himself, Tyrus confirmed that nothing was coming to gnaw on his giblets as of that moment. He leaned down to pick up the black-hafted axe and stared in awe at the glowing blades. It was light, far lighter than any weapon he had held in his life. He could swing this like a kitchen knife. He could use this to cleave his way through any demon that got too close. He glanced around again, seeing the circle of fire surrounding him. Perhaps he would have to wait for these flames to die down, but that wasn't going to be a fun time. People still howled with pain, and more explosive sounds echoed throughout the camp. Tyrus crouched low to the ground, holding the axe ready to cleave. Who was that Green Knight? Hey guys, got this done way faster than I thought I would. What do you think? Also, if you're interested, I've written an original work over on Fiction Press called Wasteland Weirdos. It's a merging of science fiction, fantasy, and post-apocalypse. If you've never heard of Fiction Press, it's the sister site of fanfiction. Literally, it's almost exactly the same as this site. Love you, sweetie. 2. Chapter 2. Yun drove his spear deep between the ribs of one of the massive coal-skinned demons and quickly released the wooden haft. The sky was dark and blackened with still rising smoke. The air became hard to breathe, and more often than not each breath was accompanied by a cough. This demon had charged down Alnus Hill right out of the gate and had been about to trample him underfoot. Yun must have used all the luck remaining in his life to dodge out of the way of that mad charge. It was like narrowly avoiding a flesh-coated boulder. The thing's eyeless gaze seemed to pierce right through Yun. The upper half of its skull was white as bone and just as smooth, with no eye holes. Despite that, however, the thing's gaze bore through him like a drill. It ignored the spear still jammed in its side, raising a massive fist overhead to crush Yun into the dirt. Its hand alone was as big as his body, and Yun knew that he would die. Before the hand could smite Yun down, a massive red ogre collided with the creature. The demon gave a roar as the ogre wrapped both of its muscled arms around the thing's middle, pinning the demon's arms to its sides. Yun drew his short sword as he stepped back away from the two grappling giants. The demon roared again as the ogre squeezed harder, its ugly face straining with the effort of holding the demon. The demon ended its roar by sinking its sharp, triangular teeth deep into the throat of the ogre, bright red blood gushing from the wound. Before he could see the results of the monstrous battle, he was knocked over by an Empire soldier, or more the man's upper half. The poor fellow had been dismembered with his intestines pouring out like hanging heaps of red rope. Yun screamed as he landed on his back as he tried to shove the corpse off of him. At least he tried to scream. All that came out was a cough. The smoky air made it difficult to breathe, and his tears were beginning to water. The dead man rolled down the small slope after Yun got the corpse off of him. He stood up quickly and cursed as he realized that he lost his blade in the collision. One of the smaller orange monsters flung an orange ball of flame into the battlefield. Others like it were doing the same, darting around the top of Alnus Hill as they threw those balls of hot flame. They didn't seem to have particular care for where those projectiles landed, for they hit man and demon alike, toasting off skin. These had to be demons. The gods had grown sick of the mortal races, and had opened the gate to hell as punishment for some unknown sin. Yun shook his head as he sprinted down the hill. He couldn't afford to think like that now. He needed a weapon. He'd be damned if he'd run away like a beat dog. Not like that bastard Tyrus. He left at the first sign of trouble. No, Yun would not flee before these dregs. He ducked and weaved through the insanity of this battle, avoiding huge demons and other creatures as he desperately tried to find some kind of weapon. He had to struggle not to bump into any men or monsters while trying not to slow his pace. Yun thought that if he actually took a moment to look on the ground, he'd find a weapon to use. The problem with that, however, was the fact that he would have to actually take the time to look. He'd have been blasted by a hell ball or torn in half by a demon if he stayed still. Formations were broken everywhere as men scrambled to fight or flee from the attacking demons. Giant red-horned monsters were cutting bloody sways through the ranks of the Empire, shattering whatever formation that would have been formed before they even began. Formations against these things was death, Yun knew, but Empire training drilled it into your head. It was muscle memory. If Yun wasn't thinking too hard, he'd be trying to form a phalanx with the poor fools getting turned into fleshy metal slag by hellballs. Time passed. He wasn't sure how much, but all he knew was that his lungs burned and his legs were becoming leaden. He somehow found himself amongst the burning tents of the Alnus encampment, the heat of burning flames seeming to sear the hair right off his arms. His body had decided to take the coward route on its own, it seemed. Not many men were weaving through this part of the camp. They were all either fighting at the base of the hill not too far back, or were fleeing like Tyrus, and Yun, he supposed. Demons blotted the blackened sky, seemingly unaffected by the inhalation of smoke. Did demons get bothered by smoke? Of course not. Suddenly his face had met dirt as his foot snagged on something. His face rebounded from the earth, and he felt a crunch on his nose. The smell of copper accompanied an excruciating pain from his nose. He groaned and sat up. Yun felt at his face and noted that his nose was now leaning a little more to the left than it used to. He ignored the pain of his broken nose as blood poured down over his lips, citing a spilled rack of polearms. Beautiful polearms. Spears, halberds, and even a couple of quarterstaffs. He grabbed up a spear and squinted at his surroundings, looking for the first beast to slay. A few darted too quickly between the tents for him to catch up with them, so he decided to return to the base of the hill. A flash of something green passed him in the blink of an eye, running towards the base of Alnus as well. Yun was shocked to see that it was indeed a man, running faster than any living thing Yun had ever seen in his life. Abruptly, the man jumped in the air, and somehow, jumped again, reaching a height even with an ogre. Then something launched from a contraption he held. A flaming golden hook on a black chain shot out, sinking into the flesh of one of the giant floating orb monsters. Its big mouth seemed to open in a scream at sighting the Green Knight. Indeed, Yun would be terrified as well, for the chain began pulling the Green Knight towards the thing at high speed. The green stranger then punched the demon in its side, launching it away in a bloody purple pulp. The force behind that strike wasn't possible. Not for a mere man. Sure, he had arms as big as Yun's legs, but he'd seen orcs punch people with less results. Yun then saw as the Green Knight then descended upon the calamity of the battlefield like a comet, his odd contraption exploding with magical thunder. Demons were shredded apart instantly by the sheer force of the small staff. An apostle? Surely he was. That meant that the gods were on the Empire's side. He ignored the small voice in his head telling him that all apostles were female. He didn't know for sure anyway. Yun had never even seen an apostle. Surely that man must be it. But of what deity? His thoughts were interrupted for the last time as a gargoyle chopped Yun's head in half. He landed, and the Doomslayer tore through the battlefield with cold fury. He blasted the face off of an imp with his super shotgun, the smoke of the double barrels invisible against the smoky field. He lashed out with a fist, crunching the skull of a gargoyle. Humans and other humanoid things crowded around everywhere, dying more than killing the scourge. They did manage to lob off a few limbs, however. He supposed that was amiable enough for a bunch of primitives. The Doomslayer launched 2 fragmentation grenades from his shoulder mount, landing far back into the pushing horde well away from the humans. They engulfed the demon scum in a satisfying explosion. Guts and other viscera flew across the battleground, some of it human, some of it not. He slashed wildly with his serrated arm blade, extending it to its full length and hacking his way through imps and hell raisers with righteous fury. He ducked under a Hell Knight's fist, delivering a powerful uppercut into the thing's throat. The power of his punch sank his fist deep into the creature's neck. Of course, this was not enough to kill a Hell Knight. The Doomslayer gripped fingers around the thing's spinal cord, tugging the whole bone right out of the creature's body. The headless corpse fell to the ground, crushing a zombie beneath it. Still holding the long spinal cord, the Doomslayer whipped it over his head like a flail and struck out. The Hell Knight's skull collided with a nearby Hell Baron, cracking in its left goat leg and spattering the now useless skull against its brown fur. Blood was invisible against the creature's reddened flesh, and it gave a roar as it stumbled from the impact. The Doomslayer brought his ballista to bear and fired it right into the Baron's horned head. The impact sent a small shockwave that was followed by the brains and face bits of the falling Baron. The Doomslayer wheeled before it could fall, and lit a whole formation of clustered imps on fire. He leaped high into the air and brought his rocket launcher to bear. Several flaming demon parts were all that remained of the suffering monsters. He should have let them burn for longer, but he didn't have much more time. He slashed, punched, and shot his way up the top of the hill, nearing the hell portal that had opened. He didn't know how Vegan knew this was going to open on this planet, but he didn't care for such things. Hell needed to be contained and destroyed wherever it cropped up. He used the ballista to clear a path towards the top of the hill, slicing cleanly through a small horde of demons. An archvile stood atop the hill, raising its hands to the sky as if to offer to its dark god. The Doomslayer growled internally as he brought his super shotgun to bear. Archviles were some of the foulest denizens of hell. He couldn't wait to end this one's existence. Its entire body was covered in a yellow exoskeleton like the insect that it was. Its elongated skull and sharp teeth matched the sharp claws at the ends of its long arms. The oddly narrow waist stood out to him, and the Slayer narrowed his eyes. He never thought to try that before. The meat hook sunk into its plated yellow chest, and the Doomslayer was pulled toward the disgusting vermin. Flame engulfed the demon, but it didn't seem to pay the flame much mind. The Archvile then saw the Slayer accelerating toward it, and its glowing yellow eyes widened. Whether through fear or surprise, he was not sure. Humans that were not busy fighting actually seemed to follow him up the hill towards the Archvile. That brought painful memories that he shoved to the back of his mind. The Doomslayer ignored them and brought the Sentinel Crucible to bear. The calming blue light contrasted the blood-soaked earth around him as the blade formed. The Argent Crucible blade remained embedded within the icon's brain, but this new one made a great replacement. The glowing blade bore no markings upon its translucent surface, and the hilt of the sword bore the mark of the Slayer, though now it was blue. Sentinel blue was one of his favorite colors. That, and demon blood. The Slayer swung as soon as he was in range of the Archvile, the humans shouting behind him in an unintelligible language. The blade struck home and clove through the thin midsection with ease. A bright blue heated line cauterized the two now separate halves of the demon. The Archvile screamed in its guttural voice, a pained cry for its foul god to save it. It lay on its back, crawling away with clawed hands while staring bug-eyed at the Slayer. He dashed up to it and punched its fucking head off in an explosion of gore and shattered exoskeleton. Ignoring the corpse, he darted towards the open mouth of the hell portal, noting that it could not have been of hellish design. It looked like it was built by human hands, not demonic. They liked to splash blood and decorate their buildings with skulls when the building itself wasn't simply alive. How was he supposed to shut this thing down? He peered through the open mouth of the tunnel, seeing a fresh wave of demons spawn heading right for him. They slowed only slightly upon sighting the Slayer, no doubt confident in their numbers. Indeed, thousands seemed to be pouring down through the gateway. Well, can't have any of that. He brought the big fucking gun to bear, the glowing green energy casting a sickly glow around him. The shouting men that had followed him went silent upon sighting it, and indeed, it was impressive. The Slayer pulled the trigger with a twisted grin upon his face, seeing the green orb reach out with bolts of green energy as it passed through the dark corridor. Thousands of demons had to have been within the kill radius of the shot, for dozens of arcing green bolts lit the entire corridor. A bright flash of green brought the Slayer's attention, but it was not the BFG that caused it. The many large embedded turquoise gems began to glow a brilliant bright green, so bright that it was almost painful to look at. The glow continued, and the Slayer ran backward, still keeping his eye on the gate. He knocked over a few people on his way back, but they would be fine, he was sure. The Slayer didn't care much anyhow. It was better to get knocked on your ass than to be dead. Indeed, several packs of demons still fought distracted men, though the number was far lower than it had been initially. How many had he killed today? 50? 1,000? He didn't keep track anymore. It was simply impossible to. At seeing the demons still alive, the Slayer ignored the cracking of the green glowing gems as he dashed away to cave in skulls and shoot through guts. He didn't see the gems explode, launching their shattered parts impossibly far, the gem fragments reaching the horizon and beyond. Those fragments tore into man and demon alike, shredding them into pieces, yet they still flew on. All he knew was rip and tear. Hey guys, sorry I haven't updated sooner. Last few days have been pretty hectic, and soon it's going to get even more hectic. I'm having a kid next month, so that's going to take some time away from this. Don't worry, I still plan on writing, but the babby comes first. The next chapters after this will be longer, by the way, so count on that. So what did you think of this chapter? 3. Chapter 3. Alright, I have finished the DLC. I've changed this chapter up a bit from what it was. Didn't take too much work, just needed to alter a few things from the Slayer's POV. I intentionally left a few details vague for now, as to avoid spoilers for when you guys play the DLC. Later on in this story, though, I will be spoiling it, but that won't be for a while. Leave me a review as always. If you don't review, I'll have to take away your base card. You wouldn't want that, would you? The Slayer's right fist found itself planted firmly in the diaphragm of a gigantic baron of hell. The beast had lost the use of its left leg due to a well-placed shotgun round to the kneecap. The flesh and bone had been torn apart by the powerful burst, and as the baron got on its other knee for support, the Slayer had taken the opportunity to deliver a killing blow to the demon's chest. A hollow cavity had formed where his punch had landed, and the demon fell forward. Seeing this, the Slayer reared his head back and bashed his helmeted skull against the demon's head. Bone crunched under metal as the Baron's fall shifted from the impact, landing the creature squarely on its back. The Slayer took a deep breath through his nostrils and exhaled as he surveyed his surroundings. Bodies lay in broken masses of twisted bones and sundered flesh. Blood painted the once green grass and was already beginning to dry. The earth was scorched bare in many places, blackened earth easily discernible amongst the bloodied grass. The corpses of man and demon alike lay everywhere from where the Slayer could see. He had somehow found himself next to the forest, his gory rampage having blinded him to his whereabouts until he just now came to his senses. He could see no vile spawn in his line of sight, and this frustrated him. Several humans wandered the battlefield, several limping or crying with anguish. Several forms picked through the bodies, screaming for the names of missing brothers in arms. At least that was what it seemed to the Slayer. He could not understand the words which spewed forth from these humans' mouths. The Slayer tapped the side of his helmet, and his visor lit up with a pleasant blue color, contrasting against the ashy red sky overhead. Several lines of code and data the Slayer did not attempt to understand flashed across the visor until the words Vega appeared. The visor then returned to its normal hue, the color of the world returning to its horrific palette. The voice of the father came through his helmet's calm. Vega Father Systems Online. What can I help you with? The Slayer pointed to the wailing men. Vega, or the father he supposed, remained silent for a moment. Interesting. I have not heard this dialect before. I will begin examining tone, body language, and context clues to begin translating. I will begin this process now. Vega's voice had remained that of the father's, that of a deep, knowing voice. It unsettled him to hear the wise tone in place of Vega's, but it did not upset the Slayer too much. He was not sure how Vega knew that a demonic incursion would crop up here on this backwater world 3 dimensions away, but it was a good thing he did. Perhaps Davith would appear, and the Slayer could crush the Dark Lord once and for all, trapping the demons within hell for all eternity and stopping its cancerous growth. Ever since the bastard escaped his hands a few months back, it had been driving the Slayer to near madness that he had not been able to find Davith. Taking the father with him, the Slayer had been combing the realms of hell and others in his search. There had been nothing. Davith was not in hell. This new hell incursion might grant the Slayer some clues as to Davith's whereabouts. Or maybe the Dark Lord would just simply be here on the planet. A man spotted him and went wide-eyed. The soldier was a man of middling height, the shine of his breastplate dimmed by the ashen sky. Falalo. The man shouted, pointing a finger at the Slayer. Falalo. Soon the other survivors took notice of the Slayer's presence, and they too began chanting Falalo, taking slow steps towards him. He turned as suddenly a blue light shone from behind him, and the Slayer was greeted with the open black maw of the circular portal. The blue light emanated from spinning blue light, which circled the whole of the portal, looking almost like flame as it whirred wildly. The Slayer slowly turned to the rift as the survivors drew closer and stepped through, leaving the mortal men behind in awe of what they had just seen. Tyrus had escaped the fire. Realizing that the flames surrounding him would only grow in size if he kept waiting, he had dashed through as fast as he was able. Whatever facial hair he had was seared off in his passing, and his left boot had caught on fire. Unable to put out the flame, Tyrus had merely removed the flaming boot with the heel of his other shoe, pinning it to the ashen earth and quickly withdrawing his foot from the burning leather. After that, he simply ran, his left foot pierced by twigs and shattered glass. His bleeding foot still pained him, but Tyrus kept running, his lungs burning and legs becoming leaden. He carried the magic axe at his side, the red glow lighting up the underside of his face. He had lost track of time and only thought to cease his sprint when the ash beneath his feet gave way to green grass. He collapsed almost immediately as his stride lost momentum, landing face first on the grass and dropping the glowing red axe to the earth. He took deep gulps of air, his lungs burning and throat tickling horribly. This intake of air was often interrupted by violent coughing fits. He lay there for what felt like forever before he finally regained his wind, sitting up from the grass and wiping the thick sweat off of his brow. He looked around him, seeing that somehow he indeed did escape from the hellish nightmare at Alnus. Tyrus had somehow ended up in an open field. This break in the forest left him open and visible for anyone to see. Tyrus did not enjoy the thought of losing his assorted giblets, so slowly he rose from the ground, again taking notice of his aching left foot. He looked down at the bloody ruin of his soul and winced. Somewhere along the way, he had apparently stepped onto shattered glass. A large chunk of glass the size of his big toe jutted from the pad of his foot. It had been driven in deep from the pounding of his feet as he escaped the horde monsters at Alnus. Other small things pierced the flesh of his foot, smaller shards of glass, some kind of tiny thorn-headed rocks that resembled the head of a goat, and sharp twigs pocked his poor foot. Now that he was aware of his agony, Tyrus fell back onto his ass and groaned loudly. He'd lose this foot for sure. There was no way it wasn't infected now. If he was really unlucky, he'd probably lose his leg. His uncle Vallard had lodged a splinter under a fingernail and lost his entire arm from it eventually. Then again, his uncle Vallard was a bit of a moron and had ignored it until it became infected. Tyrus knew that if he had any hope of saving his limb, he'd have to pluck out every single object lodged in his foot. He groaned again and resigned himself to fate. He didn't like being out in the open like this, but he didn't want to walk until he removed the various debris from his foot. He set to work on the grueling and surprisingly very painful task, removing several stones, twigs, and glass using his long fingernails as impromptu tweezers. He saved the biggest piece of glass for last, and with a grunt of pain, he removed the blood-stained shard. His foot was a ruined mess, but at least he removed most of the objects lodged within it. He looked to the sky, seeing that the sun was close to setting, bathing the forest in an orange glow. How long was his run? He ran far enough to escape the smoke cloud, but he couldn't be that far ahead of it. Give it time, and the smoke would reach him. He stood up, leaning his weight on his right foot, as to spare what grief he could for his left. Tyrus turned his sock inside out and shook the cloth, removing any shards that may have remained. He pulled it on, and only then noticed that the axe's red, glowing blades were gone. The black shaft of the weapon lay upon the green grass, sticking out and radiating menace. Tyrus took a deep breath as he gripped the weapon. He suddenly felt sick as he grasped the lower end of the pole. He didn't feel this was upon first picking it up, but now he felt as if he were being drained. Tyrus chalked it up to just the ordeal he had just been put through. He gazed upon the odd glyphs upon its surface and noticed that one glyph jutted out from the rest. Curious, Tyrus ran his finger along the glyph. It sank slightly at his touch, and Tyrus pressed it all the way down. The red blades returned suddenly, causing Tyrus to gasp. He dropped it to the ground, scrambling away on all fours. That had scared the shite out of him. The blades remained, glowing ominously as the grass beneath both of the bright blades shriveled and died, turning black beneath them. This damnable thing had to be cursed. It'd be best to leave it here and move on. Tyrus then rose to his feet once more and began moving north, the direction of his home village, and to his beloved Delilah. He made it 3 agonized steps before looking back to the axe. He stared silently for a moment before picking it up from the earth. An outline of blackened grass mirrored the whole shape of the weapon, and that sickening feeling returned. However, there was something more to the sickness, a sort of feeling that Tyrus hadn't truly felt before. Holding this weapon before him like this made him feel powerful. He could easily make it home if he simply brought it along with him. He could handle anything thrown at him, and the more he approved of the idea, the more the sickness faded. In its place was a stronger compulsion to bring his axe with him. The pain of his foot seemed numbed as he continued his way north, holding the axe to bear. Emperor Molt's Sol Augustus stared out over his capital city. Several hundred people were visible moving between the blue-tiled roofs of various buildings, carrying out their everyday lives in ignorance. The stone-cobbled streets were well worn by several generations' worth of imperial citizens soon. However, they would be made aware of how horribly the Battle of Alnus had gone. He had received word from a surviving wyvern rider a day ago on what had happened. The gate had apparently opened up to a realm of horrifying and powerful monsters. The messenger had declared them demons, and their threat could not be understated. Another important piece of news he had received was of the Green Knight of Alnus, a man who had torn these creatures apart with his bare hands. The wyvern rider had said that the knight had somehow destroyed the gate with a massive green glowing staff. Molt had frowned at that. How could such a thing be possible? He had asked that of the messenger, to which he had given a shrug. The building itself was apparently intact, yet dormant. The crystals that Molt had thought of as mere decoration had shattered at the Green Knight's magic, sending the shards far and wide across the realms of the Empire. He had consulted the highest-ranking mages and historians on if such an occurrence had happened once before, but their answers bore no fruit. One had claimed that functionality may be returned to the gate if only they were able to return the shards to their proper place. This would take years' worth of time, however, and much gold would have to be spent on the service of clairvoyance mages, as their abilities would be key to finding the shards. Molt shook his blonde head, stroking a finger through his short mustache. Perhaps he could expedite the process by offering rewards for the shards? That could prove problematic, for the common folk were sure to bring false shards and hope for gold, or even worse, demand higher pay for their surely meager efforts. Such individuals would be sold into slavery, Molt decided. That is, if he decided to go down that route. That line of thought was for another time, however. Another pressing issue demanded his attention. Some of these demons had escaped the Battle of Alnus, and the Empire's casualties were so severe that none of the survivors had chased the last of them down to finish the job. It could only be assumed that they were wreaking havoc upon his lands. This was completely unacceptable. He didn't care much for the common folk on a personal level, but he knew of their importance to a well-functioning empire. They were the most important part of any successful empire, and only a fool would say otherwise. Without commoners, there could be no mass production of food, and most of the military was made up of them. They were the heart of his empire, and he would not allow these demons to pierce it. He was aware that only a small amount of these creatures had escaped, but if they were truly as powerful as the messenger claimed, then they needed to be put down swiftly, lest they raise the people's industry to the ground. People were a resource, and Molt would not lose his resources. He would not allow the empire to fall in such a fashion. Molt would mobilize his finest cavalry and monster squadrons to finish what remained of these creatures and have their heads mounted in his throne room. His mind decided, he turned from the window, ready to give his commands to his most trusted generals. As he made way, he decided that there was one thing he needed to be done. He would have his daughter, Pina, find this Green Knight and bring him to Molt. The knight had not shown aggression to any humans during the battle, so at the least he was not aligned against his forces. Parley would be made and questions would be asked. If the knight refused, then he would be brought before his imperial majesty in chains. Tuka sat up soon after the light of the sun graced her closed eyelids. Rubbing the tired from her eyes, she sat up from her bed, allowing her blanket to fall to her lap. As always, she had slept naked. Having any kind of clothing on during sleep was simply uncomfortable. She could not stand it. She scratched her cheek and pulled her long pointed ears through her long blonde hair. It was knotted and messier than usual. Her sleep had been restless. Tuka had been tossing and turning throughout the night. Tortured by nightmares she found that she could scarcely remember. All she could recall for certain was the form of a shambling corpse, reaching out to her, the face of the undead horribly familiar to her. It was not the first time she had such a nightmare. The last few nights had granted her nothing but horrid visions. By the grace of the gods, however, she found that she could not remember most of the details. Tuka was merely left with the feeling that her dreams had been horribly disturbing. Shaking her head, she swung her bare legs off of the bed, stretching them before eventually standing up. The gnarled wooden floor of her room would likely be uncomfortable to anyone who wasn't an elf, but the naturally grown floor was comforting to her and her kin. The morning sun cast a pleasant glow, heightening her mood. Smiling, Tuka began dressing. Wearing simple green robes, she exited the treehouse, seeing her kin going about their daily lives. Elven children ran about, playing and generally causing a ruckus. The women were dressed for the weather, wearing sleeves to the shoulder and short trousers that came up just above the knee. The men were dressed similarly, but in this heat, some disdained the use of a shirt. They went about fletching arrows, gutting game, and washing clothing, along with every other daily chore that had to be taken care of. Looking down at her robes, she decided that today was likely not the best of days to wear this attire. She returned into her home and spotted her father, having just slung a bow over his shoulder. Freshly fletched arrows lay upon the rough-grown table, and he smiled at her. "You're up late again," he said, his blonde hair catching the light and seeming to shine. "These nightmares of yours are beginning to concern me." He told her sternly, "If they don't cease, I'll have to consult the elders on what should be done." The herbalist will likely have something for you that'll induce a dreamless sleep. Tuka shuddered. Father, she'll ask for me to be a test subject in return. I'm not sure which would be worse, the nightmares or her. She paused. Ministrations. I didn't say anything about a minister. Her father deadpanned. This is not a religious issue. Tuka crossed her arms and huffed. You're not that funny, father. He gave a chuckle at her words, wiping away fake tears. My jokes are hilarious. You are young. You do not understand the finer arts of comedy. He told her simply. You see, it is funny because dash. Father, Tuka groaned in protest. If you explain the joke, it won't be funny. Besides, I do get it. He raised a questioning brow. Do you? He asked in a low tone. Silence stretched between them before she finally replied with yes. Hodder Marceau was a tall elf, his blonde hair and blue eyes an almost exact mirror of her own. Despite being a mere hunter, Hodder carried himself with the pride of an elder, standing straight-backed at all times. She shared many facial features with her father, though while her face was gentle and rounded, his was more rough and square. A mischievous glint shone in his eyes, and Hodder curled his fingers and approached Tuka. She backed a step away from her father, laughing. Do not, she commanded, still giggling as she attempted to round her way back to her own room. Hodder rubbed his chin in mock thought before saying no. That was when he attacked, pinching her sides and making her squeal. You will be tickled. Her father shouted, making his voice guttural. I'm not Dash, she laughed. 30 years old anymore, you cannot just treat me like a child. He withdrew his hands and grinned. But you are my child, therefore, to me, you will always be a child. She rolled her eyes in mock frustration before returning to her chambers, her father laughing at her back. She loved the old man, but he was a total goof. She undressed once more after shutting the door behind her, dressing in the same style as the people outside. Hodder knocked once and shouted, There's something in the trees. Grab your bow. Tuka was shocked by the serious tone, but followed her father's command, slinging the bow over her shoulder and grabbing her quiver. She pulled open the door and saw that her father was out on their balcony, his bow already drawn and aiming at something in the branches. She rushed to his side, and that's when she saw it. It was some kind of orange-colored runny humanoid creature with glowing eyes and sharp talons. Pointed yellow teeth gnashed at the sight of them, and from its position in the branches, it skittered up further in the tree. Tuka had lived in this forest for well over 100 years, and never in her life had she laid eyes upon such a wretched fiend. Its claws carved deep furrows into the wood as it climbed higher and higher, desecrating the ancient tree with scars. Her father drew first, firing an arrow through its eye before it could climb too high. The shot was perfect, the arrow surely driving into the creature's brain. As it fell, Tuka noticed that the arrow became charred and blackened. Fire had spread out across the shaft of the arrow somehow, and soon the shaft disintegrated into nothing. It hit the ground with a loud thud, landing right in front of two children. The two younglings then began wailing and running away from the carcass as the rest of the village finally took notice of the body. How had this thing snuck by the watch? They were spread out a mile around the village, weren't they? What even was it? Her and her father descended the ladder to the ground level of the forest, and soon after most of the village had gathered around the body. Her father approached it slowly, gently nudging it with his foot. It gave no response. Upon closer inspection, Tuka noticed that the orange skin she saw was not skin at all. It was more of a thick orange exoskeleton. The thing's true flesh was a dark midnight blue, and it reflected the sunlight. By the gods, what vile creation is this? One of the elders shouted, It is an insult to this world. Burn the body and be rid of it now. He demanded. Several voices rose up in agreement, and Hodder rose a hand to stem the influx of voices. How did this thing get past our watch? Her father asked, voicing Tuka's own question. They have the best eyes of the village. The elves then all began looking to each other, seeing if anyone had an answer for Hodder. None came for a long while. Perhaps the creature burrowed its way here? Said that same elder, such things have occurred before with those damned mole people. Tuka shook her head. No. After the mole people invaded, we induced the trees around the village to grow longer and thicker roots. Tuka said. The elder nodded. Ah, I remember now. Those stupid creatures didn't have the capacity to figure out the usage of tools, so it keeps them out. This thing doesn't look that smart either, though. Tuka agreed, but remembered that her father's arrow had burned to cinders at contact with the creature's flesh. Perhaps it had burned through the root wall? This thing could be subterranean with its short, stocky build. Talons like those weren't for digging, however. They were too fine and sharp. The mole peoples were rough and wide. I told you idiots that we should have killed them all. Another elder shouted in a gruff voice. I bet this one is a mutant. All changed to invade a second time with an army of toothy freaks. Hodder scanned the trees around him as he replied with, genocide isn't always the answer, Gonneval. That's your go-to every time we have a problem. Gonneval shrugged, his long gray hair contrasting with his still somewhat youthful face. Only a few wrinkles were visible, and if he were human, he'd pass for early middle-aged at most. Works for the humans. Gonneval deadpanned. And look what happened when we didn't genocide them. He shouted while shaking his hands furiously. It's a pattern, I'm telling ya. Tuka followed her father's gaze the entire time, seeing if she'd be able to spot something that he could not. Ignoring Gonneval's ravings, the rest of the village did the same. She suddenly heard the scream of a woman behind her and turned to see what caused her horror. A towering red beast glowered at them from between the trees, its eyes glowing a furious green as it seemed to stare with hunger and hatred. Massive and shaggy goat legs ended in cloven hooves as it approached, its humanoid upper body bare and hairless. With every movement, Tuka could see the corded muscles working in tandem to move the horrific giant closer to them. Its huge black horned head was hideously terrifying as its gaze seemed to bore into their souls. Tuka's gaze was drawn to something the creature carried in its left claw, a huge chunk of some bloody red flesh. It was then she saw the full image of what it carried. It was an image she'd never forget for her entire life. One of the watchers on the perimeter had been carved in half, the mangled upper torso unrecognizable save for the two pointed ears, which had somehow been left intact. Tuka also noticed, to her horror, that several ropes of intestines were hanging from the demon's mouth. It played with the organs, moving them about with its pointed tongue. Tuka remained frozen in fear, her blue eyes wide as the creature began stomping towards them at full speed, dropping the carcass as a green ball of energy formed in its open hand. Chapter 4. Tuka and her father darted away from the horrid abomination, and the rest of the village followed suit, splitting the group that had gathered. She turned her head, immediately wishing she hadn't, as she caught sight of more glowing-eyed creatures staring at her from the tall branches of the trees. They may have been completely surrounded by these things, these vile creatures. Who knew just how many were there? It was entirely possible that every single watchman had been brutalized by these monsters, these demons. Tuka's eyes darted to the trees ahead of her, looking away from the big red demon and spotting what she feared. Several other of the stocky creatures crawled through the forest, on the trees and skittering across the soil, leaving several gashes in the dirt with the sharp nails of their feet. She spotted other shapes zipping between the trees, some serpentine and swift, and others large and lumbering. Upon her noticing the new invaders, the fireballs fell on her people. They seemed to come from all directions, and they shattered wood and set homes aflame. Acrid black smoke almost immediately billowing up from the now shattered remnants of huts and treehouses. Men, women, and even the poor children were set upon by demons, who lay into them with fireballs and wickedly sharp claws. Tuka saw a floating ball-shaped demon with a cavernous blue-mouthed swallow and elder hole. Villagers with improvised weaponry slashed and bashed at more of the orange stocky demons, usually to no avail. The orange carapace that covered them proved a good buffer against most anything that wasn't a strong blade or bludgeon. Tuka fired arrows into their eyes as she moved, and her father did so as well after seeing that their arrows could not pierce the hard carapace. Some of the demons fell from this, but most did not, the arrow not puncturing deeply enough to be effective. Tuka ducked a fireball that almost burned her head right off her body. She noticed the tears falling from her face as she did so, seeing her kinsmen be torn asunder before her. Sweet old rambling Gonneval was currently being devoured by 3 of the impish creatures, each tearing voraciously at the corpse as they shoved each other about, all while greedily shoving chunky red viscera down their gullets. It made Tuka sick to her stomach, but still she ran on, caught up in the panic of the moment. She had never been more terrified in her life, and it was all she could do to keep moving. It was so hard not to simply collapse right then, curling up into a ball and weeping for the horrible massacre taking place all around her. An elven child, no older than 12 took a guest, was running just ahead of her, pigtails bouncing with each step. As soon as Tuka noticed the girl, one of the floating round demons quickly descended, devouring the girl whole with one massive bite. Tuka quickly looked away from the sight, more tears trailing down her cheeks. Her father loosed more arrows as they moved, but Tuka had lost her fight. She wanted to get out of here. She couldn't take it. The air was now black with smoke, and her eyes and lungs both burned horribly. They soon passed by the well the villagers used to obtain drinking water. It had dried up last year, leaving it dry at the bottom. It hadn't been an issue for the village. They'd usually get their water from the stream nearby anyhow. The stacked white stones surrounding the hole had been so far untouched, distinguishing it from the soon-to-be blackened ruins of her home. Her father then ran toward the well, and trusting her father, she followed after him. His breathing was labored and ragged, and they both glanced about to make sure they weren't in any immediate danger. Surprisingly, the demons had not given chase to them, though that would not last forever. Most sought to attack the fleeing elves as they disappeared into the forest, but Tuka knew that as soon as they were spotted once more, they'd be set upon. She could see some now, a large fat tub of lard with two metal arms sighting them both. It began lumbering towards them slowly, lifting up its arms. "Climb in the well," he shouted at her, expression stern. "Father," Tuka asked, her voice quivering with fright. "Do it now," he commanded. "We won't be able to escape these things on foot, but we might be able to hide." Not wanting to argue, Tuka did as commanded, slinging her bow over her shoulder and climbing down into the dark depths. As she did, she looked up, expecting to see her father coming after her. He did not come, but his face was just barely visible above, looking down with his face framed by darkness. "Stay down there," he said as the screams of her people intensified. "I love you, Tuka. May the trees shelter you." Tuka was about to object, but the well was soon covered by its grown wooden lid, and a loud thump could be heard. He had just weighed the lid down with something, likely a heavy stone. What was he hoping to do? The well was big enough for both of them. No, not even just them. They could likely fit in several more people. It'd be cramped, but it would work. Tuka climbed upward, the screams of demonic howls muffled by the lid of the well. It wasn't too big of a drop, but if she fell, she might break something. She didn't care if she did break something. Speed was of the essence. She quickly ascended, using the furrowed white stone as handholds. When she reached the top, she used her dominant hand to strain against the lid while using her non-dominant to hold her aloft. The furrows in the stone were shallow, and she only barely could fit her sandaled feet within their cracks. The lid didn't budge. She wasn't strong enough to lift it one-handed. She shifted her weight, arcing her back to place both hands on the center of the lid while pushing against the craggy stone with her feet. This was dangerous, but what was she to do? She strained, lifting the lid up an inch before she felt her feet slide down over the furrowed stones. She fell scrambling to grab the walls on either side of her as she descended. Several of Tuka's fingernails were torn off in the attempt as she failed to get a handhold, and the last thing she heard before her head smashed into the hard-packed dirt was her father's blood-curdling screams. When next she awoke, she was not certain that she indeed had regained consciousness. All was pitch black, the darkness swallowing all. How had she ended up in this darkness? She felt the back of her head, feeling a large and painful welt underneath her hair. She coughed, the back of her throat tickling fiercely. The floor was dirt, but she was not outside. She could not see the sky. She felt around further, ignoring the tickle in her throat and the mounting ache in her skull. She felt rough, craggy stone, and upon touching the rough rock her fingers alighted with pain. Feeling at her digits, she discovered that she had torn out several of her fingernails and even broken her ring finger and pinky on her left hand. Her headache, the welt, her pained fingers, and other aches all combined, and she found herself taking sharp breaths as she curled up on this dirt floor. Trying to manage her pain, she began thinking about pain itself. It always helped her to do that. Trying to comprehend the feeling seemed to lessen it somehow. It did not go away, of course, but anything to quell the agony was welcome. After some time, she brought herself to her feet, head hunched down low as she began feeling her surroundings. The entire chamber she was in was completely circular. She was in the well. That's right. She fell down the well somehow. Why was the top shut? Why had no one come down to bring her out? Her eyes widened. She scrambled up the rocks blindly, ignoring the pain to her fingers and reaching the lid. The lid that her father had weighed down with a rock to keep her stuck in here. She fell down the well because she had tried to lift the cover and failed. How was she going to get out? She needed to help her father escape. As she thought on this, she noticed the eerie quiet. The wood was thick, sure, but not thick enough to block out all sound. She heard nothing from the outside world. Tears fell down her face, and slowly she climbed back down to the bottom of the well, pulling her knees to her chest and sobbing heavily. They were dead. She had probably been knocked out for too long to help her village. Everyone she had ever known was likely dead, her father included. It was too much. Despair overwhelmed Tuka as she sobbed louder. She didn't care if she was heard. She had nothing to live for. It was all gone. Tuka continued on like that for what felt like hours, weeping for her fallen kindred. A sharp crack like that of thunder broke her cries, and she stilled. More of the mysterious thunderclaps came, and several explosions followed. She stood up as the loud booms drew closer, looking to the top of the well in fright. Something pushed the rock on top of the lid. The sound of stones sliding across was clearly audible even through the rapid-fire thunderclaps above. Quickly, the lid of the well was uncovered, bathing Tuka in faint sunlight. It was morning then? Had she spent more time crying or more unconscious? She stopped thinking when she sighted what had removed the lid. One of the glowing-eyed impish creatures glared down at her from above, and much to her horror, began skittering down towards her rapidly. Tuka shrieked, and the noise seemed to silence the thunder above. She saw another large figure peer down the lip of the well. A survivor of her village? It was hard to tell as the light shadowed his figure, though she could tell it was no demon. To her shock, the man jumped down the well feet first, his right foot leading a path straight to the imp's head. Just before the armored man's boot collided with the fiend's skull, Tuka noticed the wide-eyed look of terror on its horrid face. They both landed, the imp's skull being turned to red mist underneath this hulking brute's foot. Blood sprayed the white stone red, and painted Tuka's face as she let out another shriek of fear. The man standing before him was tall and clad in green plate, the visor of his helmet oddly enough made of glass. She could just make out the outline of a face behind the glass, and she saw the eyes of what she hesitated to call her savior. That glare could drill holes through diamond, and Tuka found herself backing away quickly on hands and feet, her back hitting the wall as the man loomed over her. He looked from her to the top of the well, and oddly enough, tapped his helmet when he looked back to her. He remained silent for a moment before crouching down to her level. So he wasn't going to kill her, at least not yet. Tuka realized that this person was indeed human. No elf had arms the size of tree trunks, and his fair skin showed that he was not of orc kind. Slowly, he offered his hand to her, a massive gloved paw backed with studs. Was that a blade coming out of his other wrist? Who was this? Seeing no other option, Tuka took the offered hand, and as he stood, he helped her to her feet. The corpse of the imp twitched, and the man's eyes immediately focused upon it, making her flinch with his speed. The monster was surely dead, but the way he glared at its corpse made her shudder. The hate he projected was so intense that she was surprised that she did not taste it in the air. He released her hand and turned his back to her. The human then dug his fingers deep within the crags of the stone and stood there. He turned his head to look at her after a few seconds had passed. That gaze seemed to indicate, hurry up, and Tuka hesitantly stepped forward, wrapping her arms around the human's neck and wrapping her legs around his waist. As soon as Tuka had a good grip, the man began climbing upward very quickly. It didn't take long for them to reach the top of the well, and the human climbed out quickly. Tuka quickly removed herself from his back and witnessed the carnage that had unfolded. Blasted chunks of demon meat lay strewn everywhere, looking like the results of a spilled dinner plate. Splashes of blood dripped from the blackened trees all around, and Tuka fell to her knees at noticing them. The air was difficult to breathe, and the sky was a light red. The forest had been set ablaze, and as far as Tuka could see, there was nothing but blackened wood and ash. She saw no corpses of her kindred about, though it was likely that they were simply eaten by the demons before the human had torn them apart. How had he accomplished such devastation? Was he capable of magic? The man tapped his helmet once more as Tuka looked for any more signs of her kindred or other demons. Every home that had once been was reduced to nothing but piles of ashes on stone foundations. There wasn't even a trace of her village left aside from the well, which somehow had been spared the blaze. After another tap of his helmet, a large circular blue disc opened up right in front of her. The center of the rolling blue circle was solid black, yet somehow Tuka felt that it might lead somewhere. She turned around as she suddenly heard a collection of eerie, deep-pitched groans from behind her, and what she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. Emerging from the blackened, burnt trees, footsteps packing the white ash beneath their feet, were her people. They shuffled forward, entrails and other viscera pouring from open wounds. They had been clawed, burnt, and bitten to a point where there was simply no way they should be alive. Yet somehow they were. She stepped toward them to get a closer look, about to call out to them when the man in green plate grabbed her roughly by the arm. It didn't hurt, but it was iron-hard and firm. She struggled, but it was in vain. His strength was unlike any she had ever fought against. It was like trying to pull a limb out from beneath a boulder. Your only real option was to cut off the arm if you wanted to be freed. He began dragging her toward the whirling black and blue circle as her people drew closer. Tuka dug in her heels, but that didn't even slow him. She wasn't even sure if he noticed what with the way he trudged on. She turned to her people one last time, seeing her father at the forefront of the pack. His neck was hanging at a bent angle, with several gouges in his throat gushing bright red blood. His once bright blonde hair was now caked to his face with dirt and blood, looking as if he had finished a drunken brawl. His dead white eyes sighted her, and a look of sheer anger crossed his face as he groaned, plodding forward at a slightly faster pace. His teeth were gnashing and he swiped his hands in front of him like the claws of a feral beast. She noticed that an image of a 10-pointed star was carved upon his forehead, glowing a dark red. Tuka saw no more. As she was cast through what she thought to be a gateway, the sound of another explosion suddenly being cut off by the transfer. She found herself facing upward on what felt like cold steel tears trailing down her face as she curled up into a ball, not bothering to observe her surroundings. Her father had been twisted into some kind of foul abomination, along with the rest of her people. She had nothing. Tuka clenched her teeth, crying silently as the despair threatened to crush her mind. She lay there for a moment, clutching the sides of her head until she heard the sound of several footsteps approaching her. She looked up, seeing two men wearing reflective black armor staring right at her. They wielded these odd, long, silvery, square metal bricks. They must have been horribly heavy, and were they glowing blue out of their sides? The front of the block had a wide hole in it, and the men were pointing the blocks at her for some reason. Like the green-armored man, these two had glass visors that Tuka could just barely see through, outlining square faces and glaring eyes. Unlike him, however, these men's armor covered their whole bodies from head to toe. She almost didn't notice the group of finely dressed humans standing behind the two black-armored men. Tan-colored, long-sleeved uniforms covered them, the shirt tucked into the trousers. Human military? Was that who these were? Tuka had heard about the men of the Empire, but the descriptions didn't match these people at all. She ignored their curious stares and groggily lifted her head to peer at her surroundings. A red glow seemed to emit from everywhere in this wide chamber, giving it a sinister cast despite its clean white metal walls. It wasn't just the walls. What seemed to be solid white steel made up the entire chamber. Tuka then noticed that the group of people behind the guards were peering down at her from a short set of metal steps. She struggled to sit up, taking a long time to make it to her knees. She felt numb. The pain, both physical and emotional, was simply too much to bear, and oddly, she found herself not caring what happened next. What was the point of caring? She had lost everything important to her. Nothing left. Nothing. One of the guards shifted his block to one hand, showing Tuka the long black grip near its back as he slowly reached toward her. Tuka didn't flinch away from him, but he froze in place as a loud clang of metal against metal resounded from behind her. The guards immediately stood straight-backed and stepped to either side of the walkway. The other humans at the top of the steps all scurried away, save for one young bald human with slanted eyes, who smiled. Tuka turned back, seeing the Green Knight looming over her, his eyes hard but not angry. He pointed to her, looking at the young bald man. "Send someone up from the med bay," the young man said. "Tell them it's first contact with one of the natives, so be gentle." He sounded almost jovial, though Tuka hadn't a clue as to what he said. Other people started going off in a similar dialect. Such a rough tone. Tuka still found herself numb, unable to care, and so she remained still and silent. First off, I'd like to say thank you for over 1,000 followers. I've been writing since I was a cringy teenager back in 2014. I remember when I first got 100 followers and how elated I was. So truly, thank you. Also, I have a Steam account. If you guys want to add me, my account name is Nivilack. Also, I'm trying to have each chapter follow a single perspective from now on. I think the story will feel better to read that way. So you'll have a Tuka chapter here, Tyrus chapter there, and so on. Have a good day, and leave a review, you sons of bitches. 5. Chapter 5. The intern, a man by the name of Daniel Suzuki, stared with interest at the native girl. Besides those distinctly pointed ears, she looked completely human. He wondered how a humanoid species would evolve to grow pointed ears as opposed to rounded ones. What was the purpose of pointed ears? Were they more sensitive to sound? Daniel shook his head, running a hand over his closely shaved scalp. Ear shape was secondary to the need to learn how to communicate. The problem with learning how to communicate, however, was getting the native girl to communicate in the first place. Ever since the Slayer brought her aboard the Fortress of Doom, she had remained silent. Daniel didn't blame her. He had seen the effects a demon invasion wrought upon the mind. He'd seen many people end up exactly like this poor girl. The refusal to speak or indeed even move unprompted were good indicators, but Daniel could see it in the girl's bright blue eyes. They were empty and dead, as if her corpse were simply able to move and breathe independent of a soul. The newly outfitted medbay smelled of antiseptic and cold metal, the smell very familiar to him now. Several empty tables sat aligned on a nearby wall, different tools and machines ready for use. Only one sat occupied, however. The elf girl stared at her hands in her lap, a white blanket draped over her legs. Her fingernails had been torn off somehow, and she had a horrible concussion from a wound to the back of her head. The head wound, however, was deemed not to be the cause of her catatonic state. Daniel knew that already. That wasn't the look of someone who got brained to hard. That was trauma. One of the guards stood nearby, his plasma rifle hanging laxly in his grip. He was a tall, broad man, wearing advanced black-plated armor with a narrow ballistic glass visor, which seemed to stare at everything and nothing at once. This man would be Tubbs. Daniel had found his and his partner's inclusion on the expeditionary team an interesting one. Apparently, the Slayer had marched right up to the poor guy and took the rifle right out of his hands. Daniel had burst out laughing at the story after hearing it. Tubbs hadn't thought it was funny, but his partner Jose constantly brought it up in their off time to irritate Tubbs. Jose wasn't in the med bay currently, meaning he was probably on the bridge overlooking the new planet. There wasn't much guarding to do on the floating citadel, but it was important to keep the peace between crew members. Months being cramped into an ancient floating fortress with the world's angriest mute constantly glaring at everyone tended to put people on edge. There have been a couple of arguments already, but nothing serious. Besides Tubbs and Jose, there were around 20 guards patrolling the lower decks, all dressed and equipped with the best weapons and armor the UAC could provide. Tubbs waved to Daniel, who returned the gesture, approaching the man. Daniel wasn't short, but Tubbs was a lot taller than him, as tall as the Slayer even, so he had a lot of presence. "Sup?" Tubbs said. "Nothing much." Daniel replied, "How is she doing?" Tubbs glanced over to the poor elf girl and shook his head solemnly. "She's fucked in the head, buddy," Tubbs said simply, knocking on his helmet for emphasis. "Just like a lot of survivors on Earth are. I don't know how long she's going to take to recover, but we won't be translating anything from her anytime soon." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze being drawn to the many engravings on the metal wall behind Tubbs. The poor girl was broken now, just like his home planet. They had a few doctors running tests on her, but their experiments were limited by the onboard mental health specialist Carrie Lee. The diminutive woman insisted on waiting until the patient was in complete control of her faculties before she could agree to any kind of testing. A few doctors had agreed reluctantly, but there was one among them that scorned this idea. Daniel hadn't seen Henry Helmer, or Dr. Helmer, as he preferred to be called since the elf girl was brought aboard a few hours ago. He had insisted that they begin drawing blood and studying the girl's biology immediately, greatly interested in her extraterrestrial origin. Thus the conflict between him and Dr. Lee had began. The quiet argument had quickly devolved into a shouting match before Jose and Tubbs took them to separate rooms on the ship. Daniel would need to find a way to smooth things over between the two when he could. They were all going to be living in the Fortress of Doom for a while yet, until this demon incursion was stopped. He tried to ignore the fact that technically everyone aboard the fortress was technically AWOL. The UAC hadn't approved of all this personnel leaving Earth. What were they supposed to do, though? Let Davith escape to grow in power? The father had explained that to Daniel and several crewmen, saying that the Slayer couldn't save this world and find Davith quick enough on his own. The Slayer hadn't raised any objection, but he couldn't speak, so his exact feelings on the matter were unknown to the crew. Daniel was certain, however, that if the Slayer had not wanted them aboard, he would have stopped them. He had not, which meant that he must have agreed with the father in his own way, whatever way that was. He turned from Tubbs and approached the girl, who stared numbly at her bandaged fingers. A large bandage was wrapped around her head as well, the cloth wrapping from around her forehead to the back of her skull. I know you can't understand me, but I'm sorry for whatever happened to you. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. I hope you can recover okay, he said, tone gentle. She blinked once, then looked up into his eyes. Daniel stared into those bright blue marbles, seeing the pain they had endured. This poor girl had a long way to go before she could conquer her trauma, but Daniel didn't think she was completely hopeless. He had seen people with completely dead eyes, as if their very souls had been torn from their bodies. This elf girl was almost to that point, but in their brief eye contact, Daniel caught a faint glimmer of emotion, pure, unadulterated anger. If she overcame her pain and grief, Daniel pretty much guaranteed that she would want revenge on the demons for whatever they had done to her. He wasn't certain if that was a good idea, but who was he to stop her? She definitely wouldn't be leaving anytime soon, especially with the science team squabbling over what to do with her. Personally, he hoped that Dr. Lee would be able to keep their claws out of the elf girl. Despite her inhuman nature, her injuries, both physical and mental, seemed extraordinarily human. She looked back down to her blanket, lips pressed together in a line as she seemed to examine her white hospital fatigues. Her previous articles of clothing were currently being studied under all kinds of microscopes and other gizmos that Daniel didn't understand. He was a techie. He didn't understand that field very well. Dr. Lee hadn't been able to save the elf's clothing, but Daniel didn't think that dissecting clothes was that big a deal. He took a step back from her and turned, seeing Dr. Helmer standing straight-backed in the doorway. He was a tall man, gaunt and imperious, looking like some kind of old wrinkly lord waiting to pass judgment on the peasants beneath him. He strode up to Daniel, both hands clasped behind his back as he moved. The tails of his white lab coat reached down behind his knees, flowing behind his stride. The green UAC vest worn beneath it bearing a pale plastic card on the breast. The ID card was old and slightly scuffed, depicting a younger, seemingly happier Helmer, with long brown hair instead of the short wispy, white hair Helmer had now. The Helmer of today looked more like a constantly disappointed grandfather, in comparison to the smiling youth on his card. The good doctor should really get it updated. Helmer strode right past Daniel without even a glance, coming to a stop right next to the elf's bed. He seemed to dissect her with nothing but that piercing gaze. Tubbs stood up and moved next to the older man, leaving his rifle slung at his side. Helmer spared the guard a glance and scoffed, glaring back down at the girl. First contact with a new species that's non-demonic, and little Miss Lee thinks to tell me that I can't perform the most basic of tests. He spoke, more to himself than to Tubbs. Those clothes won't be enough. My team needs more. Helmer then reached into the pocket of his lab coat, and Tubbs caught the arm. The guard kept a tight grip on the older man's wrist, but not enough to hurt the older man. Helmer glared at Tubbs, whose reaction was hidden behind his helmet. Daniel sighed. Tubbs wasn't a pussy, that was for certain. He may have gotten glared down by the Slayer, but compared to him, Helmer was nowhere close to being as intimidating. Will you unhand me? Helmer asked, tone firm yet gently. The sample I want is quite mundane. Buzz off, creep. Tubbs said, tone low, I got orders. Helmer shook his hand out of Tubbs' grasp, scowling. Daniel saw in the old scientist's hand a pair of nail clippers. Daniel frowned, looking at the girl's fingers. There weren't any nails for him to take. Oh. He glanced to the two lumps at the end of the bed, completely covered by the blanket. Toenails. Grody, your orders were given to you by little Miss Lee. not your commanding officer. And, pray tell, who exactly would that be? Helmer asked, raising a thick white eyebrow. You louts haven't a command structure, so don't go preaching to me about how you're just following orders. We are AWOL from the UAC. Tubbs shook his head, stepping between Helmer and the girl. Then I guess I'm just following a suggestion. And I suggest that you leave before I make you. Helmer's scowl deepened, but he relented, placing the clippers back in his pocket and storming out of the med bay. Tubbs hung his head back in a slightly exaggerated way. Man, he began. What an asshole. Daniel nodded, approaching Tubbs with a casual stride, proffering his fist. Tubbs bumped it with his own armored fist, and they blew it up, wiggling their fingers, Daniel making an explosion sound with his mouth as they did it. That was so awesome. Daniel said, I hate that guy. Tubbs nodded. Man, who fucking doesn't? If he wasn't so old, I woulda already laid him out. They both laughed loudly, drawing the elf girl's attention. They both stopped and stared back at her, and Daniel saw something else in her gaze. He couldn't really define it, but it looked like she was looking for something. When she didn't find it, she turned her head back down to her blanket, slumping. Daniel and Tubbs looked to each other and shrugged. Tubbs slapped Daniel on the back, grabbing his attention. So what you doing later? Want to hang with me and the boys? Tubbs asked. Me and Jose will get our day off after this shift. Daniel nodded. Yeah, that sounds awesome. You guys got Furious and Fast 22 right. Tubbs flashed a thumbs up. Yeah, dude. With Din Visal and the Pebble. Hell yeah. Or I mean hell no. But like, yes? I don't want to say hell yeah cause, well, you know, a little bit of a short chapter one no, but with doing single perspectives, I want the chapter to be done when I feel it's done. Leave a review and tell me what you think. Or I will find you. 6. Chapter 6. Tyrus swung his head upwards from the cool waters of the stream, gasping as he did so. His wet hair was slicked back against his scalp, but damn had it felt good. He hadn't drank anything for an entire day, not since he'd fled Alnus and got his magic axe. Tyrus hadn't slept, keeping north as he limped in the direction of his home village. He wasn't quite sure how far away it was, but he knew it had to be north of the gate. He stood and dipped his bare foot in the river, the cool water washing away the dirt of yesterday's flight. He pulled out his foot and lifted it up from the ground, using his good leg to support his weight as he stared in shock. Only thin white lines were any indication of previous injury. Tyrus looked to the magic axe and shrugged gratefully. He would not question axe magic. Tyrus knew better than that. But this was a demonic axe. Maybe it wasn't such a good. He would not question the axe magic. It had healed his foot after all, and it felt so nice to hold too. Tyrus sat back down on his rear, the morning dew of the grass beneath him wetting his backside. Normally that would annoy Tyrus. He hated it when he got his clothing wet. But the joy of finding a fresh stream was simply too overpowering. The cool morning air was chill against his skin, which had began to take a slightly pale shade. Perhaps he was getting sick? He hadn't eaten anything either. Could his complexion be a result of his missed meals? If so, he needed to fix that post-haste. Man's gotta eat. Problem was, though, he didn't have a pole to fish with or bow to hunt with. Tyrus had decided that he could just eat any bugs he found, and he began picking through the grass. He'd never been squeamish about eating things considered outside the norm of society. Besides, he had to have eaten thousands of bugs when he was a kid, and Tyrus had turned out just fine. He dug through the moistest dirt he could find until his fingers prodded something slimy, and he grinned with delight as he pulled out a massive earthworm. Bloody thing had to be at least a foot long. This'd keep him going for a little bit at least. He approached the stream with the wriggling bug in hand, washing off the dirt still covering the thing, before pulling it up out of the water. He held it above the stream, staring at it as it wriggled in his grasp. You know, he started, I understand this is an unfortunate fate for one such as yourself, but you gotta understand, I'm starving here. He reasoned with the bug. It wriggled slowly, uncertain. Tyrus frowned at the response. You can't bargain with me. I'm a deserter. I gotta do what I can to survive. You were just unlucky. It ain't my fault you ain't got no legs to run away from me with. He told the worm, who wriggled slightly more violently in response. Don't be like that. I'll chew you up quick. You'll feel right at home. My tongue is just as slimy. Tyrus said, sticking out his tongue for example. Its violent wiggling now increased further, as it thrashed about wildly to free itself. Tyrus paused. What the hell was he doing with this worm? Was he just trying to entertain himself? He thought on that for a second as the worm continued in vain to free itself from its oncoming doom. Little fellow was really feisty. Tyrus held up the worm to the sun. I'll call you Jim after my buddy. He is as much a stubborn arse as you are. Tyrus nodded to himself. He was indeed trying to entertain himself. No need to prolong Jim's fate. He opened his jaw wide, ready to engulf Jim in his entirety. As Tyrus almost had Jim within biting range, a thunderclap sounded in the distance. The shock of the noise startled him, and he dropped Jim into the stream with a light splash. Tyrus watched in horror as the worm was swept away in the rapids of the gentle babbling brook. His dinner was gone. More thunderclaps sounded from that same direction, one immediately after the other. He looked to the clouds overhead, seeing a completely clear sky as the thunderclaps drew closer. He scooped up the handle of his magic axe and jumped across the narrow brook, heading straight for the trees. Most dimwits would likely be curious about the rapid thunderclaps, not him. He ran through the forest at an even gait, looking back as the noise drew closer and closer. His breathing was growing labored, and he felt as if he were beginning to sweat out all the water he had just drank when finally the thundering ceased. Near the end there, Tyrus thought he could hear distant demonic screaming from the same direction, but still he ran on, not wanting anything to do with mystery forest noises. Was it so much to ask for a bloody road? A road was free of demons and loud noises. At least he hoped it was so. The demon part hopefully was. Tyrus realized that the latter likely was going to be noisy anyway. He'd have to ditch the uniform at some point, lest someone out him as a deserter. Balls to that. He wasn't going to run the gauntlet willingly. He'd leave it on for now, though. He had no desire to traipse through the woods stripped to his undies. Delilah would have a field day with all the insults she could make up for him. He slowed his run to a light jog, looking behind him every once in a while to be sure he wasn't being followed. Eventually, after a good amount of time running, he decided that he was in the clear and put his back up against a tree, sliding down to the gnarled roots beneath him. Damnable sweat caked him from head to foot, ruining his good mood. Hopefully he'd be able to find another stream around here somewhere. Shite, where was north again? He stood up after catching his breath, seeing the sun still rising toward the center of the sky. He put his left shoulder to its direction, causing him to face almost directly north. Certainly, there'd be a road up ahead somewhere. He began moving at a slow pace, his growling stomach a cruel reminder of his missed meal. Jim would have been delicious. He had been taken too soon. Tyrus then heard skittering claws to his left, and before he knew what he was doing, he dropped to the ground in a somersault. Something soared over his head mid-roll and landed on what sounded like all fours. He stood up quickly from the ground, sighting a demon glaring at him with angry orange eyes. It was one of the smaller ones, with the orange carapace and soft blue flesh beneath. His breathing quickened, and his legs pounded the dirt as he sprinted away from the impish-looking fiend. Had to get away, far away. Searing heat singed his patchy beard as a ball of orange fire passed right by his head. His ear felt hot with stinging pain, and he gripped the handle of the axe, desperately pushing the button to flare it to life. Thankfully, the glowing red blades shot to life immediately, the crimson glow casting its light upon half his body. He turned around quickly, realizing that if the imp could throw fireballs at him, then running away was pointless. The imp came to a standstill, looking warily at the axe Tyrus wielded. By the gods, did Tyrus want to run away, just to be away from here? It snarled at him and conjured up another ball of flame, lobbing it at Tyrus, who only barely managed to duck forward under the hot ball. He reared back his axe as he got close to the imp and swung, hitting only air as the imp backpedaled away. It swung a clawed hand as it moved back, catching Tyrus in the side of his head and destroying his ear, tearing it to bloody ribbons. He screamed in pain and backed away quickly, clutching the ruined flesh of his tattered bloody ear as the imp readied another fireball. Blood slicked one side of his face and poured down Tyrus's neck. He ducked the incoming fireball once more with an awkward shuffle to the left and darted forward again, letting go of his ear and gripping the axe with a strong two-handed grip. His ear hurt like hell, but if he babbied it now, he'd get fried. The fireball he had just dodged impacted with a nearby tree, instantly lighting it afire and cratering deep into its center, flaming with fragments flying. Thankfully, this tree was somewhat isolated from the rest, but if it fell over, it'd likely cause a forest fire. That had pissed the elves off for sure, but really, who cared? They were just elves, prancing about in their stupid little. He ducked another fireball, cursing for letting himself get distracted. Tyrus needed to get close to hit the damnable thing, but he so very much wanted to not be clawed at again. He cast hesitation aside and leapt forward once more, swinging his axe with all his might. As before, the imp darted back, bringing a claw down to rake across his face. This time, however, Tyrus was ready for that, ducking his head back after the creature dodged and swinging once more at the creature's now exposed arm. The red blade bit into the demon's flesh with a sizzle, like freshly butchered meat thrown on the pan. Tyrus noted that the accompanying smell wasn't all that different from cooking meat actually. The demon's arm parted easily and it howled in agony, the limb being hacked off at the elbow. Tyrus noted that no blood poured from the wound, as he expected it would have. Instead, the axe seemed to have cauterized the stump entirely as it went through. He stared in awe at the magic weapon. Never before had he sliced through something so easily, like a knife through water. It backed away, clutching its useless stump as it screamed in agony. Tyrus swung again, closing the distance with a yell. The imp backed away again, but this time ran off into the forest, quickly vanishing among the many trees as it zigzagged through them. Tyrus fell back on his ass and let out a sigh of relief. He really wasn't dead. He'd defeated one of them. Sure, he may not have killed it, but it had remembered to fear the mighty Tyrus. The tree that had been set on fire fell over, landing right in front of him with a resounding crash. Tyrus screamed like a little girl, backing away on all fours as the flaming tree sent black smoke into the air. Thankfully, it didn't begin rolling in any direction, the ground beneath it being flat. He stood up, dusting himself off. The tree didn't collide with any other tree, thankfully, but knowing that demons were in this forest for sure meant that a fire was inevitable. He needed to get the hell out of these cursed woods. He felt at his stinging ear, noting that the torn flesh felt significantly less rent than it had been before. Tyrus frowned at this, not ungrateful for the axe magic's work of course, but regretful that he wouldn't get any wicked scars from today's epic battle. Maybe he'd get lucky. This wound was way deeper than what his foot had went through, and those still had white lines. Delilah would be so impressed with him. Women thought battle scars were sexy. The more ugly they made a man, the more attractive it seemed to the fairer sex. With that, he began trudging through the wilderness once more, looking for insects to eat or a river to wash off in. He still hoped for a road most of all, but he decided that if he were going to find one, it would most certainly be found last. Here's another shorter chapter than usual, but again, I want to publish these when they feel done. This means that future updates will be more sporadic as each chapter will vary in length. Leave a review or I'll eat your pet.